I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest on Ukraine's surprise incursion into Kursk as Russian civilians flee the fighting and the Kremlin's propagandists struggle to hold the line. We also round up the latest political and diplomatic news and look back over the past week of breakneck battlefield updates.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Cleave stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Monday, the 12th of August, 2 years and 75 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nicholls, foreign breaking news reporter Iona Cleave, foreign correspondent James Kilner, and Brussels correspondent Joe Barnes. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine and Russia.
Yeah, hi David, hi team, how are we all doing? Kursk and beyond, which I'll speak about in a moment. But firstly, the Kursk operation is continuing. It's mainly heading north, northwest and south, which I know is all over the place. But essentially that salient, that push that Ukraine have achieved over the border into Sudza, the town Sudza, a few miles away into Russia. What was last week looking like there was one very clear avenue to the northeast and another to the north, they seem to have all smoothed out, basically. So there's now a nice lozenge of Ukrainian held territory inside Russia. Of course, all of this is very, very difficult to try and put any certainty on at all. In fact, I wouldn't even go that far. So it is very difficult to say what's going on and exactly where the lines are. But it seems that that's what's happening. Now, there are reports that Ukrainian elements have been seen in the town of Giri. That's about 20 kilometres southeast of Sudza, which is a fair old distance. And there are some reports of border crossings into Russia's Belgorod Oblast. That's to the south of Kursk Oblast. Nothing like the strength of what we've seen last week. But the town of Kolotinovka, which is about 50 k's due south of Sudza, about 40 k's southeast of Sumy, so Sumy in northeast Ukraine, about 40 k's southeast of there, that appears to be in Ukrainian hands. Now, that is about 40 k's south of Giri, as I mentioned at the start. So there's a suggestion that Ukraine is now trying to push in two distinct areas, so Kursk and Belgorod, knit them all together, smooth out the border region there. As I was suggesting last week, if you have a nice smooth border, it just makes it easier to defend if that's what they plan to do. Now then, this morning, Moscow has responded to these latest pushes. They were evacuating civilians from the area. So far, 76,000 civilians have been moved out of Belgorod. And then Vyacheslav Gladkov, who's the regional governor, said residents of the Krasnaya Yaruga district, that's just to the east of Kolotinovka that I mentioned a moment ago, they're being moved to safer places due to, as he says, the threat of enemy activity on the border. Not quite on the border, mate. They're about 20 k behind you. But anyway, now then, back in Kursk, and a video shared online shows, or purports to show, two Ukrainian soldiers. We believe they are soldiers wearing Ukrainian uniforms, but it's, as I say, very difficult to verify any of this. Two Ukrainian soldiers pulling down a Russian flag from the council building in Verdikova. That's a couple of k's over the border inside Russia. And then separately, another group of soldiers filmed themselves raising a Ukrainian flag while trampling a Russian one in a video uploaded and located by the BBC to a Russian administrative building in the village of Gorevo, which is about 15 k's south of the other one. Now, Oliver Carroll for The Economist says that, citing a popular Russian Telegram channel, says Kyiv is creating a full-fledged fortified area with a field hospital, strong points and dugouts in the rear of the advance. Of course, there's all the speculation as to whether or not this is intended to be a permanent feature or if it's some sort of prolonged raid or what have you. But digging in and taking a field hospital with you does not speak of a reconnaissance in force. Now then, Russia's Ministry of Defence released footage purporting to show 3 strikes on Ukrainian armoured vehicles in the vicinity of Kursk. Now, it's very notable that there's been very little social media footage from Russia around this area. It's a good indicator that they are a little bit at 6s and 7s, a little bit on the back foot when it comes to getting their communication message straight, and also they're busy trying to work out what's going on. But Russia's MOD, writing on Telegram, said, after analysing the intelligence data received, a decision was made to conduct pinpoint fire impact on enemy armoured vehicles using Lancet loitering munitions. They're always very wordy in these statements. They then went on and said, objective control footage obtained in real time made it possible to verify the destruction of the identified targets, which I think they are saying that they hit them, but I'm not sure. Now, Russia appears to be building new defensive trench lines in the Kursk region, in the vicinity of the Kursk nuclear power plant. That comes from the BBC and elsewhere. I've seen that over the weekend. Again, that speaks of, well, I mean, that's very interesting. If you're digging in around your nuclear power plant, nothing says that your 3-day lightning offensive 2.5 years ago is going brilliantly, I would suggest. Sticking with the BBC, Steve Rosenberg, their man in Moscow, very good guy to follow. He said Russian TV last night did actually use the word invasion for the first time, but was portraying the news in the wider context, still portraying it as a terrorist attack. He said the overall presentation on the media was couched in a way to play down the incursion and leave the impression that it had all been contained. There are also reports Russia has moved forces from the Kharkiv area, in particular that Vovchansk lodgement. Remember, north of Kharkiv city itself, that Russian border incursion a couple of months ago now that never really did anything. There's reports that Russia's taken forces from there and also from other formations way down south in the Kherson area to bolster the Kursk and Belgorod areas. Now, the problem Russia have got here is reacting to a very dynamic situation, deciding, acting, and then organising what to do. It's very tricky. They have a very rigid top-down military structure, as we've mentioned many times on the pod. So trying to react to an unforeseen event, and I think it was unforeseen, whilst also taking on control other units, is always going to cause a headache for commanders. Now, the Ukrainian military observer Konstantin Mashevets, speaking yesterday, he said Russian forces have thus far redeployed 10 or 11 battalions from across Ukraine into Kursk Oblast, but he suggested that these battalion units were well below their normal strength. The Institute for the Study of War say that this will likely further exacerbate the disorganisation of the Russian response, as battalions are now probably more like company size. So a battalion of about 400, 500, 600 fighters are probably now around company size of 100, 120-ish, something like that. Part of the command and control problem they've got is how to organise it. In Western doctrine, NATO doctrine, we have what's called operational command and operational control, and they mean different things. And essentially, to boil it all down, it means, can you just tell another unit to go and do something, give them a mission, give them a task to go and complete, or can you actually just take the personnel and do with it what you like? So can you grab an artillery unit, for example, and say, right, lads, you're no longer artillery gunners, you're now infanteers, go and get in that trench. So it all depends on the command relationship, as it's described, that you have, or that commanders have over units that are put under your command. And it can get very, very complicated very quickly. Now, trying to assess what units is where is very tricky. For example, Ukraine-based open source intelligence organisation Frontelligence Insight, they say drone units are now seen to be deployed separately from their parent organisations because they have a very specific skill set and they can be easily deployed. Grab a few drone dudes and go and add them to another formation. And therefore, just observing drone activities and badges in prisoners of war and all that kind of thing in any given area doesn't necessarily mean that that drone element's parent unit is there in its entirety. So it is very, very tricky to get a feel for what's actually happening on the ground. The ISW, Institute for the Study of War, they note that Russia's decision to assign the defence of Kursk Oblast to the FSB, to Russia's FSB, the Federal Security Service, rather than give it to the military, whilst also trying to integrate conscripts, FSB, and Rosvardia elements, the kind of National Guard element, that's going to make things even harder. And their assessment is that Ukraine's invasion of the Kursk region has allowed Kyiv to seize the battlefield initiative for the first time since at least the end of last year. They say since November 23, Russia's been able to determine the location, time, scale and requirements of fighting in Ukraine. Now then, Ukrainian action, they're saying this has forced the Kremlin and Russian military command to react and redeploy forces and means to the sector, to the area, and contests Russia's theatre-wide initiative in at least one area of the front line. And then for the first time over the weekend, in his nightly address, President Zelensky acknowledged the action. Ukrainian military commanders and politicians have been very tight-lipped about this. But on Saturday, he said that Ukrainian forces had begun to push the war into the aggressor's territory. And he said, I think every unit of our defence forces that makes this happen. So still the expected fog of war, David, very confusing to see what's going on. However, it does appear that some of those lines, maybe the advance has slowed down, but the lodgement, Ukraine's invasion, incursion, whatever we're going to call it, seems to be fattening out. You don't have the prongs sticking out to the north and the east. They all seem to be blobbing out into a fairly coherent whole. And better take a little pause there, David.
Well, thank you very much, Dom. There's a few more stories I think you should talk us through and comment on before we come to Iona, Joe and James. So, Dom, one other story that I think we need to give a bit of time to is news coming out of Russia and Ukraine around the nuclear power plants. What can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so I mentioned the Kursk nuclear power plant a moment ago. Put that to one side and concentrate on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, Ukraine's nuclear power plant down south that was taken by Russia and held since the early weeks of the full-scale invasion. Moscow and Kyiv both accusing each other today of starting a fire on the grounds of the plant. It's Europe's largest nuclear power plant. This came out yesterday. The UN's International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, basically the nuclear watchdog, has got a presence at the facility, 6-reactor facility, said that its experts there had seen dark smoke coming from the northern area of the plant, from one of the cooling towers. There was a lot of reporting last night from various sources saying that Russian forces had started burning tyres to create smoke. IAEA said at the time that there was no risk to nuclear safety. However, the IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, speaking late last night, he said these reckless attacks endanger nuclear safety at the plant and increase the risk of a nuclear accident. They must stop now. He didn't attribute blame for what was going on. Now, Moscow-installed official, speaking earlier today, said the fire had been completely extinguished, and the head of Russia's state nuclear energy company, Rosatom, said that the cooling tower may need to be replaced. So this is being interpreted as just saying, well, be careful what you do up north because we've got this. We can have an effect on the power plant down south. President Zelensky said that Russian forces had started the fire as an act of blackmail. He said currently radiation levels are within norms. However, as long as the Russian terrorists maintain control over the plant, the situation is not and cannot be normal. Since the first day of its seizure, Russia has been using the Zaporizhia plant to blackmail Ukraine, all of Europe and the world. We are waiting for the world to react, waiting for the IAEA to react. He said Russia must be held accountable for this. Only Ukrainian control of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant can guarantee a return to normalcy and complete safety. So I think it's a bit of nuclear power plant rattling going on, I think. Now, separately over the weekend, a Russian held gas platform about 40 kilometres off the northwest coast of Crimea, so in the Black Sea, that was hit on Friday night with what's thought to be Ukrainian maritime drone and thought to be an effort to destroy the Russian-based GPS jamming equipment that's thought to have been on the site. It was still on fire yesterday. Defence analyst H. Sutton said the fire likely prevents Russia from reinstalling the equipment. He was suggesting about 40 Russian troops were stationed at the platform. The living quarters are under an attached helicopter deck that's connected to, but some distance away from the main structure that was burning. And therefore, they probably survived, but it looks like the whole gas production rig is going to be ruined. And whatever's still burning is probably escaping gas. But it's yet more efforts, expected to be by Ukraine, to destroy the jamming equipment that Russia's placing there to try and stop the drones getting into Crimea and other missiles that use GPS. Now, outside the country, a couple here, David, tensions with Belarus went up a bit over the weekend. Ukraine said that they could not see any additional Belarusian troops being deployed to the border between Belarus and Ukraine. This comes from the State Border Guard Service. This came after a statement the day before by Alexander. He's in charge of Belarus at the moment, but after a widely discredited election in 2020. He ordered reinforcements to the border areas near Ukraine following allegations that several Ukrainian drones had been shot down over the country on Friday. Now, I've not seen any other evidence for that, but there has been wide reporting in recent months of Russian Shahed drones going a bit rogue and landing in Belarus. Ukraine State Border Guard Service spokesperson Andrei Demchenko, he said the situation along the border is fully controlled. We do not record the movement of either equipment or personnel near our border. And just finally, David, the German manufacturer Rheinmetall is going to supply tanks to Czech Republic, to Czechia, as part of a swap to support Ukraine. So the Czech army is going to receive 14 Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks and one armoured recovery vehicle. Very, very important to include those. In turn, the Czech army is going to send military equipment to Ukraine. Now, the total value of the order is in the low three-digit million euro range. Rheinmetall said in a bit of a clunky statement, said delivery going to start at the beginning of 2026. Yet another one of these industrial strands to try and shore up the Ukrainian defence industry, well, hopefully post, but possibly still during the conflict. And I will take a pause there.
Thank you very much, Dom, for talking us through all of that. I'm sure we'll come back to you for your final thoughts at the end. Iona, Cleave from our foreign desk, can I come to you next? There's a few political and diplomatic updates you should be able to take us through before we go to Joe and James. Iona.
Hi, thanks David. And yes, while all eyes are focused on Ukraine's incursion into Russia, there's been several notable stories bubbling away in the background. Starting with Beijing weighing in on Ukraine's current invasion, its foreign ministry today urged both Ukraine and Russia to follow 3 principles for de-escalation in the situation. It listed these in a statement as no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no fueling of a flame by any party. China, the statement said, will continue to play a constructive role in promoting a political solution to the crisis. Although claiming to be neutral, China hasn't condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine and instead forged increasingly close ties with Moscow. Just as some context there for you. And the next, in other news, the UN has said that July was the deadliest month for Ukrainian civilians since October 2022. At least 219 civilians were killed and over 1,000 injured across the country during last month. The organisation said in a recent report they showed a trend of increasing casualties since March 2024. And then one of the worst days came on July 8th when Russia carried out mass aerial attacks targeting Cleave, Dnipro and other cities, killing over 43 people, including 5 children. And then there's been another high-profile arrest of a government official in Ukraine. One of Kyiv's 4 deputy energy ministers has been accused of taking a $500,000 bribe and was arrested on Monday along with 3 alleged accomplices, Ukraine's security service said. The minister, whom the SBU did not name, allegedly demanded mining industry officials pay him to transfer equipment from mines in the frontline region to a coal basin in western Ukraine. The minister and the 3 alleged accomplices were caught red-handed, the SBU said. Ukraine has been plagued with corruption for years, but Volodymyr Zelensky has promised to rid his country of graft and has arrested and jailed many officials in the process. And the last story I'd love to touch on is a new Reuters investigation found that £1.8 billion worth of dollar and euro bills have been shipped to Russia. That's despite the US and EU banning the export of their banknotes there in March 2022. Customs data revealed that Russia has managed to circumvent the sanctions continuously and that the cash was transported largely via third countries, including the UAE and Turkey, both of which have not imposed restrictions on trade with Russia. The evidence also suggests that dollars and euros have become useful tools for Russians to use for trade and travel despite the war. And then interestingly, the ruble weakened to its lowest level today since May after Kyiv launched its surprise incursion into Kursk. And that's it from me.
Well, thank you so much, Iona, for joining us. And listeners, Iona is running the Telegraph's Ukraine live blog today. So if you go to our website, go to the live blog, see Iona's work there, you'll be able to follow the latest updates from the Telegraph's foreign desk. Thank you so much, Iona, for your time. James Kilner, can I come to you next? You've been looking at and writing about the situation in Kursk. Let's return to the story of the day. And you've been looking at the Russians who have fled Ukraine's incursion. What have you found in your reporting over the weekend?
Hi David, yep, I was on this story, picked it up from Joe on Saturday morning. So I wrote 2 main stories over the weekend. One of them seemed to have been swallowed up by the Telegraph website. That was on Saturday. It was about something that Dom touched on. It was the reaction, very surprising reaction, even within the normally granite hard propaganda that the Kremlin puts out. There were definitely some cracks in that. Dom was quoting the correspondent in Moscow, but if someone who's read the Russian media extensively and regularly over the last 2.5 years, this was definitely a departure from the norm. Reports in Russian opposition websites said that the Kremlin put out an edict sometime around Thursday evening around the scenario, the Ukrainian invasion in Kursk, telling them to play it down, telling them to frame it as part of the Russian existential threat against Nazi Ukraine, compare it to World War II, the normal propaganda list that we've become used to. But it did seem, when I did all the research on Saturday, that the normal suspects, the normal websites and TV programmes and Telegram commentators were actually struggling to stick to this propaganda line. And that, David, shows the extent, really showed the extent of how unnerved mainstream Russia has been by this. I think we can call it a sort of a very, very serious invasion by Ukraine, the first major invasion of Russia since World War II. There have been sporadic cross-border attacks by pro-Ukrainian Russian groups, but this is on a completely different scale. So we saw a newspaper like Correspondent send a correspondent down to Kursk. He tried to get to the town Sudzha, the centre of the initial attack, and couldn't make it. And he wrote this very detailed report about how he drove down the road. He persuaded taxi drivers to drive down the road with him from Kursk, which is roughly 75 miles northeast of Sudzha. And initially the taxi drivers were like, yeah, sure, I'll take you. I was fishing there only a few days ago, it's absolutely fine. These reports were overextended, there was nothing particularly going on down there. And the closer they got to this town, the more blown up cars, they saw smashed up cars, etc. There's one, the correspondent describes one smoking, until eventually the taxi driver loses his nerve and says, I'm not going any further, I'm turning around. And then they whiz back to Kursk, and this Correspondent correspondent reports how relieved he was to turn around. And then when he's there, he then reports on the chaos that the people who fled the town tell him that their evacuation, how they fled for their lives and swam for their lives and grabbed what they could, etc., etc. You had various pundits, normally very reliable propaganda pundits on TV Canal, the main BBC One of Russia, who were openly saying, how can this happen? How can this happen to Russia? Of the Ukrainian invasion. You had another analyst type character of a Kremlin-sponsored think tank pontificating on Telegram, calling it a slap in the face of the Russian military. So there's palpable nervousness, anger, frustration with the pundits, with the correspondents in the Kremlin propaganda machine, and also with people who have fled the region. Now, the reason that I'm spending a bit of time on this propaganda element, and like I say, it's a shame that the Telegraph web machine has sorted out this story. This is very important because this is the absolute rock that Putin has relied upon to protect his version of why Russians should be dying in Ukraine and the Kremlin should have invaded in February. This is his magic pill that he's feeding the Russian population. If cracks start to appear in this propaganda war, he is in trouble. Now, to hone it in on what I was saying yesterday, there are reports that Putin is absolutely furious. Of course, it has undermined what he thought was a coup the week before, his spy swap, and it's a terrible embarrassment that he's now having to defend inside Russia. So there's that. There's businessmen telling other Western media organisations that they are in shock. I spoke to one of my contacts in a major Russian city last night, and this person told me that they were in shock and that they know people who are dashing down to Kursk to get relatives out of the city. I also spoke to one very hardcore pro-Putin Russian chap in St. Petersburg, who was saying that Putin's going to rebound, it's going to play into Putin's hands. It highlights exactly why we had to go for war, and he's going to crush Ukraine after this. But what this has done, it has really put the war back into the mainstream of Russian society. They're having to think about it again, they're having to talk about it again. Previously, for the last year, I'd say, it has been on the back burner. It's been something which has been going down in the south of the country and in occupied regions of Ukraine. Now it's back in the mainstream, being talked about in Moscow coffee shops, etc., etc. So really, really important David. One small news update to bring up to date. Putin's just held a Security Council meeting and he looked absolutely furious. He had all his top security chiefs there, including Gerasimov, his top general, who's taken a lot of the flak for failing to defend the Russian border. And he just read from a list of handwritten notes. You can see him flicking through his handwritten notebook, his brow incredibly furrowed, and then these 8 senior guys on either side of this long table looking like they were taking a real bollocking, and he basically told them to sort it out. And he obviously span it for his own propaganda ambitions and said, well, this proves why Ukraine and the West were not willing to take my ceasefire offer earlier this year, because they're planning this invasion, these are Nazis, etc., etc. But basically he was there giving his top generals, his top guys, a real ticking off.
James, just a couple of questions on the propaganda front that I think you so expertly talked us through. Do you think the reason that it seems like they're in such a panic is to some extent, right, like they can't deny what's happening? There is an invasion, it's happening right there, they don't know what's going on at the front. And to what extent is it also the fact that there isn't an obvious line to take just yet? And I guess the follow-on question from that is then, how will we as outside observers know and understand that they may be starting to get back on track?
I think you're absolutely right, David. I think this is way beyond the narrative that they ever thought that they would have to deal with. These cross-border attacks that I briefly mentioned by these pro-Ukrainian Russians, last year I think they were, and maybe the year before, they were absolutely tiny by comparison. They were just a quick raid in and out, blow something up and retreat. This is like full capturing territory, which no Russian president has had to deal with since Joseph Stalin. How do you explain this to a population where Putin's very raison d'etre, his very pillar of his presidency since New Year's Eve 1990-2000, is being the rock of stability and providing Russia with security and outward strength? This is absolutely humiliating. People will not know what to say, I think. And I think this is the reflection in this normally hardcore propaganda machine that is normally so disciplined and is really starting to crack, which is absolutely remarkable. The frustrations of the ordinary people being evacuated, that was standard. They were angry and they were blaming local officials, etc. They were not blaming Putin. That is absolutely standard trope in Russia. People were making appeals to Putin on Telegram videos for help and saying how he had been let down by his underlings. That is normal Tsar, great leader speak in Russia. So we're going to have that dynamic to play out, and we're going to have to see how it progresses in this Security Council meeting, which just happened in Russia now. It shows Putin trying to take charge again. Now it's getting personal. Now he's really trying to direct the efforts rather than leaving it to his underlings. How and when we discern that Putin feels things are getting better, I think that's when we see the propaganda tighten up again, and we see more images of Ukrainian troops being captured and tanks being blown up and pushed back from the border, etc. And the headlines which are coming out now of another, I think they're saying 180,000 people are being evacuated from the region now. Stop. Until that happens, I think this is definitely Russia on the back foot, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they pull this one round. Putin's apparently ordered conscripts to the region, which is very unusual. He's ordered mercenary groups linked to Russian companies into the region. Remember, these are staff predominantly with hardened ex-Wagner fighters, so they're tough guys, and he's diverted tank battalions, etc. So a lot going on there, a lot of panic on the Russian front. Yeah, let's see where it goes, David.
Thank you very much, James. Just one final question, maybe to James, Joe and Dom, before we go to Joe's roundup of what we've seen over the past few days. To what extent is the reaction we're seeing in Russia similar or distinct from the Wagner rebellion of last year? Because, of course, that came out of nowhere on the road to Moscow. It seems to me that we see some similar sorts of reactions, but I'm just interested to see what's different about this, do you think? But also what's the same? I don't know if Dom, Joe or James, you want to comment on that? It might not be much, it's just a thought that occurred to me.
Yeah, well, if I could jump in there, David, I suppose the most obvious thing is that the Prigozhin's all mutiny, no bounty ended when he chose it. We don't know if he could have made it to Moscow, but they got a good couple of hundred Ks up the way. They killed 13 Russian service personnel, brought down a helicopter, but then they decided to stop. And there were implications, as we all know. The difference here is that we don't know what Ukraine's aims are and whether or not they want to stop at all. We know that Putin and that Russia decided to keep the border open. They weren't even gambling. They just totally discredited this idea that Ukraine had the forces that could go across the border. They thought that they were so totally maxed out, just trying to hold back the tide in the Donbass and elsewhere. But they were so totally consumed with their task in Ukraine that they didn't have the capacity, the combat capability to actually go across the border. So Russia largely left the border open, and there were some border fortifications and what have you, but they weren't covered by fire and by eyes. They didn't have anyone there being able to warn if someone was trying to break through. And that's now been shown for what it is. So if Putin's now having to put in conscripts, which, by dint of don't know what they aren't going to be as well trained, equipped and led as some of the other units. I note James's point there about the other Wagner units or the groupings that are attached to various industrial and business entities. But essentially, they're not regular formed troops. So if that's what's in the area, I mean, that's extremely vulnerable if you're relying on that. So I do think that the initiative now is still with Ukraine, whether or not they can and they want to continue to support this, try and push further. But really, it depends how much risk they want to take for their personnel and the all-important equipment that they've got. But Prigozhin showed that there's not an awful lot to stop an armed force that really has its sights set on moving in a certain direction. Admittedly, at that time, a lot of Russian commanders, we think, did have a clue quite early on what was going on and decided to sit this one out and see who was actually going to win. So it's not a direct parallel. But I think what it's shown is that those forces are left inside Russia to be able to handle. It's one thing having lots of police that can go and bully their way around and arrest people and take people off the streets. But you've suddenly got a T-72 pointing straight at you and coming at you at 30 k's an hour, then that's a very different problem. So I think there are parallels, but we should be cautious about trying to take them too far, David. But I do think the initiative is still very much with Kiev's forces here.
David, can I just make one point, picking up on what you and Dom were saying? The Prigozhin mutiny last year. In the fallout from the Prigozhin mutiny, one of the things that Putin did, one of the things he was so keen on, was beefing up his Rosguardia. These are the National Guards, etc. He really put an emphasis on them, and he gave them extra military capacities, such as having their own artillery units, etc. Mainly because one of their key jobs is actually guarding the borders. They don't come under the Russian Ministry of Defence command. They have their own command structure. They look like military personnel. They have military equipment, they have military uniforms, etc. They have APCs, and now they have artillery and some other serious kit. But they have their own command structure. And it's their job to defend Russia's border. That's primarily their main role. They get involved in other counter-terrorism and crowd control stuff. And they were drafted in the initial invasion of Ukraine because the Kremlin thought it was going to be such a cakewalk and that they would need these guys to keep the peace, so to speak, in a tough manner. But since then, their job has been to guard the national borders of Russia. So this is a massive humiliation for them. This is a massive failure. This is a massive failure of Putin's post-Prigozhin strategy. So, that is also going to come into play later.
Thank you very much, Dom and James. Joe, let's go to you. You've written up for The Telegraph a big long read, which we'll put in the show notes, on looking back over the past few days. And as more information has come out, trying to understand exactly what happened in the first few hours and days of Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. What can you tell us about this? What can you fill in from our understanding that at the time, of course, we're a daily podcast, we're scrabbling around to try and understand ourselves. Would you like to tell us the story?
Yeah, so my weekend task was basically to look at and try and build up a genuine picture about how this all started, how it happened. And a lot of it, I must admit, is from Russian sources, because the Ukrainians have been very tight-lipped about this. It took them days until they actually admitted that they were there. So early last week, Russian commanders in Kursk, so these are local regional commanders, probably like border guards, as James was just describing them, were starting to warn to their superiors, their higher-ups, probably back to Moscow, that there was an unusual build-up of Ukrainian forces on the border. Drones had started to basically hammer trench lines manned by these inexperienced border guards, often conscripts, in places that hadn't been attacked before. So there was some unusual activity. But Moscow paid little attention to the situation. They had it in their mind. They agreed with themselves that, look, this is a quiet section on the front line. We don't expect anything to happen. We have Ukraine on the back foot in Donetsk, in Luhansk. We've got this front in Kharkiv where we're pressing. Ukraine isn't going to be able to build a force that is capable of doing anything across the border. But little did they know, Ukraine had basically been going around some of its frontline units and saying, this was often with less than 24 hours notice, going, hi guys, you are being rotated away from the front in Luhansk, wherever you are posted, but you're not going to get rest and recuperation. You're coming with us. You're coming to Kursk, without actually telling them what they were going to do until they got onto the border. But then essentially they were brought to the border with little resistance. Kiev's men were able to haul electronic warfare systems to the front and started knocking out Russian communications. At the same time, they were using these newly seen first-person view drones, but they're a lot quicker, and probably the ones that we've seen hitting helicopters recently. But they were being used to strike Russian surveillance drones in the sky. Their aim was to knock out communications, knock out the eyes in the sky, and basically leave the marshy fields below completely without any sort of intelligence over them from a Russian perspective. And then, about 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning, came the initial thrust. We believe hundreds of Ukrainians, supported by, say, a dozen or so tanks and some armoured vehicles, steamed across the border in what is the first foreign invasion of Russia since the Second World War. So the initial footage we saw were Ukrainian Humvees moving through dirt paths around tree lines, dropping people off to jump into tree lines. And we believe that was in the direction of Sutska, the logistical town, home of the last gas shipment point to Europe for Russia. Strikers, they're the American armoured vehicles, were also seen crossing the border, suggesting that basically this wasn't just, as previous raids have been, using the Russia Volunteer Corps, the Russian Legion, which are these Russians who are anti-Putin, pro-Kiev. This was actually proper conventional Ukrainian forces using some of their best equipped battalions, brigades, etc. And then this started growing throughout Tuesday. There's some German-made Marder armoured fighting vehicles were spotted, and reports of that. Then Russia first notified the world of fighting in around a cluster of villages near the border. And at this point, there was a video of fighting. It looked like a fuel tank on the highway. 2 fighter jets, Russian fighter jets, flew by at perilously low altitude. But that was basically the last time we really saw any Russian aircraft in the vicinity of the border, because during the chaos, Kyiv had managed to bring up to the border, we believe, Franken-SAMs, this combination of whether it be Soviet launchers, Western radars, or various amalgamations of that thing. There's no one size fits all with these things, as well as Soviet era launchers and systems. But they were brought up to the border. Russia quickly claimed it had headed off 300 strong Ukrainian reconnaissance and sabotage force, which had subsequently retreated after coming under very early fire from the Russians. But Moscow's defense ministry was forced to delete that mention of a Ukrainian defeat after basically more evidence of Ukrainian successes started appearing on social media. So what we saw is like reports of destroyed Russian observation posts. We started seeing Russian soldiers, now prisoners of war, being brought together and basically humiliatingly captured and marched back towards Ukraine. You could see them flanked by Ukrainian soldiers coming with their sort of blue tactical markings. And yeah, what's interesting about this is, and I think it's quite noticeable, is when Ukraine has launched, well, let's go back to its main last counteroffensive, the summer counteroffensive, that was basically launched mainly with new brigades that have been created, trained by NATO, equipped by NATO forces, and basically prepared and brought together purely for these counteroffensive thrusts, the free offensives that we know about, but I won't go into those. That's by it at the moment. But this is actually brought together using some really battle-hardened soldiers who have been actually really experienced on the front line. They've seen some of probably the worst of the fighting in Donetsk, etc., etc. And they're basically up against these guys in Russia who are conscripts. They've probably had weeks of basic training. Like, they're a National Guard service. Well, so conscripts aren't volunteers, but that's basically what they're akin to. So they don't have any experience on the front line. So as soon as you actually get some guys who are probably pretty scary when they actually know how to do a bit of maneuver warfare and actually have experience holding a gun and firing it in anger, they're suddenly you get these Russians who look quite panicked. So Sutska, we know, is the final operational shipping point for a pipeline that carries natural gas and Russian national gas. It's owned by Russia, so to Hungary and Slovakia. Kiev's forces had reached the southern tip and the western outskirts as the day drew to a close. The assault on Kursk had sort of basically taken Moscow completely by surprise. As the days go on, we start learning that there are at least 4 elite Ukrainian brigades, or at least parts of them. Ukraine is known to bisect, however you want to break up these brigades and have them into smaller units. I think battalion size, Dom knows better at these things than I do. But basically, there's elements of at least four elite brigades were part of this. Russia said 1,000 troops, but actually that was probably all that was in Russia at the time. And we believe there is probably between 10 to 15,000. And what we had actually seen going in is just the sharp end of the arrow. The point that actually Ukraine has built something, it's built of bringing together a force that is capable of actually doing something substantial. So by the second day, Ukraine had opened up this salient about 10 miles deep, at some point 6 miles wide, and controlled 11 villages, which actually, if you paint a picture against that today, the governor of Kursk, who was in that meeting with Putin, this national security meeting or whatever meeting it was, has come out and basically said now, today, so this is as of Monday, August the 12th, 28 villages and towns in Kursk are occupied. So actually 11 on the first day, and then about a week later, they've more than doubled that. That's quite an impressive feat. And then at this time as well, Kyiv was also thinking about the long-term game. So this is when you start to know that actually maybe it's not just a smash and grab. Kyiv were looking, they were bringing more troops in. So from that reserve, the second, third echelon forces behind the front line, you've got reports of them mining roads to stop Russian reinforcements being rushed into the area. And they're bringing more air defense to the border, basically, to stop Russia having air superiority. So 320 miles away in Moscow, Putin accused Ukraine and called it a large-scale provocation. He blamed Ukrainian forces for shelling residential homes, ambulances. And Valery Gerasimov, basically, the top general, is saying things like, look, we've killed a third of Ukraine's 1,000-strong force. But all through this Kremlin propaganda, you start to see no evidence of anything that looks like Russians stopping this invasion, this incursion, this advance. You've got pictures emerging from Sudset, and with a bit of caution, all of this comes a day or two late. So it's hard to put into genuine sort of chronological order when this all happens because the fog of war is so intense. But you've got Sudset, where apartment blocks can visibly be seen and destroyed by fighting. You've got reports that Ukraine has captured the gas metering station, which is about 5 miles inside of Russia, just on the outskirts of Sudza. You've got reports that Evgeny Podubny, who's a pro-Kremlin war correspondent, reports that he's dead. It later emerges that his car was just simply hit by a Ukrainian drone and he was seriously injured. Residents were fleeing as Russia was dropping glide bombs and other forms of aerial assault reportedly on its own area in a bid to unsettle the Ukrainians. But then meanwhile, you've got more footage being shared on social media of Russian prisoners of war, waving the white flag, surrendering to advancing forces. You've got Kyiv is still pouring more men, using these reconnaissance enforced breakaway units, highly mobile. They're circumnavigating around the main fortifications and just basically driving around and seeing what they can see. They'd gone up what's known as the 38K030 highway between Sudza and Kurarevo, which is about 6 miles from the international border. You've then got Russian military bloggers. They're reporting fighting around Koronevo, which is about 20 miles from Sudza. Other battlefield footage shows what Ukrainian sources have said was the first proof of an FPV drone strike on a Russian helicopter midair. And that's just in the first 2 days. That's an incredible amount going on. But then as it builds up, you've got sources now suggesting that 2,000 Ukrainian troops are in Russia. So as you enter the third day, you've got the Korn group, which is a small group, quite lively on social media, of Ukraine's 116th Mechanized Brigade. They're sharing videos of their armoured vehicles. Basically, I wouldn't even say trundling. They're moving at quite a pace through Russian fields, and alongside this, they're going, look, our vehicles are moving on Russian soil like it's our homeland. We will turn it into Ukrainian soil soon. Basically, look at the complete difference that Ukraine faced when it tried its counteroffensive through Ukrainian territory, and it hit these massive minefields that are bigger than anyone's ever seen before, to just being able to just move freely around Russia. So yeah, Ukraine had captured such a large opening of territory that we actually started seeing Ukrainian helicopters flying over Kursk. We've actually seen, it's again hard to verify, but we've actually seen what people are claiming to be Ukrainian fighter jets flying inside, or at least on the border, because basically the lack of Moscow's surface-to-air missile systems, but also because Ukraine has been able to block out the sky. It's basically moving at breakneck speed. No one really knew what was going on. You were having to piece together all these reports. Yuri Podolyaka he's a Ukrainian-born, he's a pro-Russian blogger, had mentioned in his report on the third day that Ukraine had got almost as close in the direction of Lvov, which is a town about 30 miles north of the Ukrainian-Russian border. And actually, lots of videos showed traffic jams trying to leave the city, driving away from it. So people trying to leave at these reports. So there is a genuine chaos made up of women and children trying to escape these towns, and they just don't know what's really going on. There was then some great footage of Russian citizens said that foreign troops with NATO equipment were to blame. And then basically this is where I think things start getting interesting. So there's more reports that US-made Bradley fighting vehicle were part of the vanguard. And then you started getting questions to Washington. Basically, people were going, did you have prior knowledge? Did you give approval? Have you been providing intelligence for this operation that Ukraine's carrying out? And the Pentagon said, look, Ukraine is well within its rights to do this. But at the same time, we're then getting reports, and it's from the Washington Post reporting this, that Ukraine is now going, look, hey, why don't you start letting us use ATACMS, the medium to long-range ballistic missiles, and we can use them to start hitting the Russian airfields that Russia is going to use to retaliate against this incursion. They were basically saying, look, if you, Washington, give us permission, we can probably hold on to a portion of Kursk for quite some time, and we can really start doing some things. We don't know if permission was given for ATACMS, but then we saw the first HIMARS strike on Russian soil against what was the first believed attempt by Russia to start pouring reinforcements into Kursk. So we saw what was footage of this later, came out the next day. It was a column of trucks carrying probably what experts think is between 200 and 400 infantry troops. And that was basically taken out in a HIMARS blitz. And it's then at pretty much we don't know at the same time, but the same evening, you've got Ukrainians SBU security services are carrying out a drone attack on the Lipetsk airbase, which is about 200 miles from the border and east of the current fighting in Kursk. Ukrainian officials were quick to say, we think we've destroyed at least 700 glide bombs, which were kept in ammunition warehouses on the base. On the base were also dozens of fighter jets and helicopters being stored. That is going to start inhibiting the way that Russia can retaliate. And then throughout Friday, Russia's state broadcasters basically continued to air images of Russian troops, artillery, tanks, rocket launchers being brought into the Kursk region, battlefield maps, which were published by Russian sources. You look at the likes of Rybar, Two Majors, all of these big Telegram accounts are all publishing maps and analysis. They appeared to show Ukraine's reconnaissance groups, these big thrusts with no intention of capturing land, probably going well above the line of communication, but they had been slowed down. But there was little sign that Kiev's bridgehead was under any serious threat. Ukrainian troops started posing for photos next to easily identifiable landmarks. One Ukrainian unit clambered up onto a road sign outside the town of Umivka and started marking it with blue and yellow tape, the colours of Ukraine's flags. And then another unit held a Ukrainian flag in front of it. It was the Gazprom building in Sudska. And noticeably, at this time, Russia was still saying, look, we've not lost full control of Sudska. That's enough to believe that is under Ukrainian control fully by this point. The calm, it was enough to infuriate military bloggers. So Two Majors suggested that even with the Russian reinforcements arriving, Ukraine was still, quite extremely far away from being thrown back. Apti Aldanov, who is the commander of the Chechen Akhmat Special Forces unit, being sent into Kursk to basically stabilise the situation. He's accusing Moscow of deceiving them over the nature of the crisis. And then basically you've got other stories about, as the cover of darkness draws over, you've got for tonight fighting along the highways continues tough. In fact, the enemy is holding on to road infrastructure. Another military blogger says, look, another challenging day has come to an end. It's not enough to be an easy night. And you've got other stories about, and this shows what Ukraine has thrown into this and the thinking and planning is, I think Roland and I wrote about it quite a while ago, that there was basically a disparity between Ukrainian and Russian forces when it comes to nighttime fighting, because Ukraine was better equipped with night vision goggles. That advantage dissipated on the Ukrainian front lines, but now we've got reports of Ukrainian special forces units with full night vision going around raiding towns and villages in Kursk where all there is guarding them is sort of National Guard or conscript brigades and battalions that are being cobbled together, maybe even pulled out of training, because there are quite a few notable still training grounds around that area in preparation for the freshly mobilised Russians. Yeah, it's just all a bit chaotic, but I think that's how I see it.
Coming up, we hear Dom, James and Joe's final thoughts. Let's go then to our final thoughts. Dom Nicholls, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks, David. I'm looking for signs of how Russia's going to play this. Putin's a great one for talking about red lines, things you can't cross, and all the devastating and demonic things that are going to happen if you do. And I just wonder what he's going to do here, because I wonder if he's painted himself into a bit of a corner when it comes to red lines. If you look at the narrative that's starting to come out of Russia, you've got them saying, well, it's a NATO plot, it's a Western plot, it's the French. I've seen some comment about how they're going to be returning French body bags to Paris, all this kind of nonsense, because they don't really know what to do, and they don't want to admit that Ukraine are able to do this on their own, albeit supported by Western donated equipment. But this can only have come from NATO and the US and so on and so forth. So what have they got to do? I mean, they either admit that it is Ukraine acting on its own, in which case there's a massive dent for their morale and pride and all that kind of stuff, or they say, no, it's a Western plot, it's the French, it's the Americans, it's the Brits, Germany, all the rest of it, NATO, blah, 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 blah. In which case you're then into the red line that Putin and others have talked about Western forces on the ground, not only on the ground in Ukraine, but on the ground in Russia. I mean, when it comes to nuclear rhetoric and red line, it doesn't take anything for, if you take the occasionally sober Dmitry Medvedev, for example, he always threatens nuclear Armageddon every time he steps barefoot on a piece of Lego. So forget him. But Putin has rattled this nuclear saber before. So is he going to do something again? We've seen this incident down at the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant that seems to be interpreted as just remember what we've got here, guys. But it's not a million miles away from that to put the nuclear card back on the table. And I wonder how Putin's going to try and play this. It's interesting he's put the FSB in charge of the operation, standard, what they're calling a counter-terrorist operation. But I don't think that's going to necessarily work against a fully armed conventional manoeuvring force. So quite where do they go? And I'm looking, as I say, I'm interested in seeing what the statements Putin makes. It's one thing being very angry in a National Security Council and doing some performative sort of politicking for the cameras, but actually what is he going to say? Because he hasn't got an awful lot of room left to talk about unless he goes for the nuclear saber again. I would imagine we'd hear some other stuff from the likes of Medvedev and his ilk before Putin actually says something. But where else can Putin go with this narrative? Because he's boxed himself in with his red lines about what to do if there was a Western attack in Ukraine, let alone inside Russia itself. So going to be keen to keep an eye on that, David.
Thank you very much, Dom. James Kilner, can I come to you next?
I think Dom's absolutely right. It's going to be very interesting to see how the Kremlin reacts to this. Putin's got to get a grip of it very quickly. He really doesn't have very much room to manoeuvre. As I was saying earlier, his Rosguardia unit has already failed him on the border. The men summoning around him at the Security Council with the usual suspects. His Ministry of Defence is already going through some huge transformations as they arrest corrupt officials. There is a new man in Minister of Defence, Andrei Belousov. So they're going to have to act very quickly to show ordinary Russians that they're still the strong power to keep ordinary Russians safe. This is, as I said, what Putin's whole presidency is based on. So there is going to have to be a very strong reaction from Russia, I think. It's worth picking up on the point that Joe was making about conscripts. This is a really, really sensitive subject for ordinary Russians. They hold conscripts in a different light than ordinary soldiers. It's seen as more of a rite of passage for young men rather than a major military fighting force. They're not actually legally allowed to be deployed overseas, although it does seem that some were caught up in Ukraine fighting and died out there. But reports that some conscripts have been killed in the initial fighting and other conscripts are going to be diverted to Kursk is a real... You're moving towards a red flag. This is getting into desperation danger territory for the Kremlin. So I'd keep a very close eye on that. There's another really interesting thing coming up on the horizon for everyone's diaries, which the Kremlin will be fully aware of at the beginning of next month. I think it's the 10th or 11th of September. There are governor elections around Russia, including in Kursk. So they're going to have to manage that in the run-up. That is also a major propaganda headache, disaster. And then the only other thing I'd like to say is picking up something Iona mentioned very cleverly about the impact on the ruble. It is down 5% against US dollar and euro, etc. Not that is very much traded at all in euro or US dollar ruble, but that is an indication of this panic that people view this invasion with. And also, really importantly, and this is the critical thing about the Russian economy and Russian finances at the moment, there's been a huge problem, a major liquidity problem with Russian rubles and yuan, Chinese yuan, which means that the Kremlin is having serious problems accessing financial markets. There was a huge spike in the cost for Russian banks for trading yuan last week. There's a huge demand to buy yuan from the Russian central bank because they can't get enough of it from China itself, etc. So this invasion, the dent in the ruble, the Chinese making a rare statement about Russia-Ukraine war, etc. This is very, very serious for Putin.
Thank you so much, James and Dom. Joe, after your epic recap of the past few days, Joe, just a couple of words from you.
A few points. One of them is, and one of the noticeably different things that we picked up is how very few Russians actually surrender when they're in Ukraine. These are what we think can consider to be the Russian professional soldiers, even if they are poorly trained and not very professional. Instead of surrender, they will often shoot themselves. But actually, en masse, we're seeing in Kursk, we're seeing these people, hands up, white flags, giving up very easily. And walking into the Ukrainian hands. So interesting difference there.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.